The morning fog hung low over Riverside Cemetery, turning everything into soft shadows and whispers. Richard Morrison's black Mercedes pulled through the iron gates at exactly 7:30, just like it did every Saturday morning. He preferred coming early before the groundskeepers started their work, before anyone else arrived to disturb the silence. Richard was 58 years old, though most people said he looked younger. Money had a way of preserving things, even grief. His gray suit was perfectly pressed, his shoes polished to a mirror shine. Everything about him spoke of control, of order, of a man who had built an empire from nothing and refused to let anything slip through his fingers. Except, of course, the one thing that mattered most. He parked in his usual spot under the old oak tree and sat there for a moment, hand still on the steering wheel. 3 years. 3 years since the accident. 3 years since he'd gotten that phone call that shattered his world into a million pieces. The police officer's voice had been kind but firm. There had been rain, a sharp curve, a moment of lost control. His son Daniel was gone before the ambulance arrived. Richard took a deep breath and stepped out of the car. The morning air was cold against his face, carrying the scent of wet grass and distant flowers. He reached into the back seat for the white roses, Daniel's favorite, and began the familiar walk down the stone path toward Section 12. He knew every step by heart now. Past the Morrison family plot where his grandfather rested, past the angel statue that watched over the children's section, past the bench where an elderly woman always sat on Wednesdays, talking to her husband's grave like he was sitting right beside her. Richard understood that impulse more than he cared to admit. He'd had entire conversations with Daniel in this place, saying all the things he should have said when his son was alive. The path curved left, and Richard could see Daniel's grave in the distance. The headstone was simple black granite, elegant but understated. Daniel would have appreciated that. His son had never cared much for showing off, which had been a constant source of frustration for Richard. How could you build a business empire if you didn't want people to notice you? But as Richard got closer, he stopped walking. Something was wrong. Someone was there at Daniel's grave. A small figure was kneeling in front of the headstone, and even from this distance, Richard could hear the sound of crying. His first reaction was anger. This was his time, his private moment with his son. Who dared to intrude? He walked faster, his expensive shoes clicking sharply against the stone path. As he approached, he could see it was a young boy, maybe 10 or 11 years old. The child was thin, wearing a jacket that looked too light for the cold morning. His dark hair needed cutting, and his jeans had patches on the knees. In his small hands, he held a bouquet of wildflowers, the kind you could pick from the field behind the cemetery, not buy from a florist. The boy was crying softly, his shoulders shaking. He didn't seem to notice Richard's approach. "Excuse me," Richard said, his voice sharp. "What are you doing here?" The boy jumped, startled, and quickly wiped his eyes with the back of his hand. He looked up at Richard with wide, frightened eyes. They were red from crying, and there were tear tracks down his cheeks. "I'm sorry," the boy stammered, scrambling to his feet. "I didn't know anyone would be here this early." "That doesn't answer my question," Richard said, trying to keep his voice steady. "Why are you at my son's grave?" The boy looked down at the wildflowers in his hands, then back at the headstone. I come sometimes, I'll go. I'm sorry." He started to move past Richard, but something made the older man reach out and catch his arm gently. Up close, Richard could see that the boy's jacket wasn't just thin. It was worn through at the elbows. His sneakers had holes in them. There was a vulnerability in his face that reminded Richard painfully of Daniel at that age. "Wait," Richard said, his voice softer now. "I'm not trying to chase you away. I just want to understand. Did you know Daniel?" The boy hesitated, looking like he might bolt at any second. Then he shook his head slowly. "No, sir. I never met him," Richard frowned. "Then why are you here? Why are you crying at his grave?" The boy bit his lip, clearly struggling with whether to speak or run. Finally, he said quietly, "My sister knew him. She asked me to come here, to bring flowers on his birthday." Richard felt something shift in his chest. "Your sister?" "Yes, sir. Her name was Linda. She passed away 8 months ago." The boy's voice cracked on the last words, and fresh tears spilled down his cheeks. Without thinking, Richard guided the boy to a nearby bench and sat down beside him. The anger had completely drained away, replaced by confusion and a strange aching curiosity. "I'm sorry about your sister," Richard said, and he meant it. He knew what that kind of loss felt like, how it carved a hole in you that never quite healed. But I still don't understand. How did she know Daniel? The boy wiped his nose on his sleeve. They were friends. More than friends, I think. Linda was in college, same as your son. She talked about him all the time, especially after she got sick. Sick. Richard's mind was racing, trying to place a Linda in Daniel's life. His son had been private, especially in his last year, but surely Richard would have known if he was serious about someone. She had leukemia, the boy said quietly. She was really sick for a long time. The treatments were expensive and we didn't have much money. Mom had already passed and Dad left when I was little. It was just Linda, me, and Grandma. Grandma's too old to work much anymore, and Linda couldn't work because of the treatments. The boy paused, staring at the flowers in his hands. Linda said your son helped us. She said he was the kindest person she ever met. When she was too sick to go to classes, he brought her notes. When she had to stay in the hospital, he visited her every day. And he paid for things. Medical bills, medicine. He told Linda it was from some charity program, but she figured out it was him. Richard felt like the ground had shifted beneath him. Daniel did that? Yes, sir. Linda said he never wanted credit for anything. He just wanted to help. The boy's voice grew stronger, more passionate. She said he made her feel like she mattered, like her life was worth fighting for. Even when she was at her sickest, your son made her laugh. He told her stories about wanting to help other people like her. He had all these plans for a foundation or something. Richard sat very still, trying to process this information. Daniel had been supporting someone through cancer? Paying medical bills? The son who had fought with him constantly about business school, who had insisted on studying social work instead of following in his father's footsteps. Richard had been so angry about that decision. They'd barely spoken during Daniel's last semester. Why didn't Linda ever come to the funeral? Richard asked quietly. The boy looked down. She was too sick. She was in the hospital that week, really bad. She cried for days when she heard about the accident. I think... He paused, struggling with the words. I think losing your son made her give up a little. She tried to keep fighting, but her heart wasn't in it anymore. Richard closed his eyes, feeling a wave of emotion wash over him. His son had been living an entire life he knew nothing about. While Richard had been pressuring him about internships and business contacts, Daniel had been visiting a dying girl in the hospital, using his own money to pay her medical bills, giving her hope. Before Linda died, the boy continued, she made me promise something. She said I had to come here on your son's birthday every year and bring flowers. She said I had to thank him for her because she never got the chance. Today's his birthday, isn't it? November 14th? Richard nodded, unable to speak. He looked at the wildflowers in the boy's hands, probably picked early this morning from the field. The child had kept his sister's promise, had come here to honor a man he'd never met, crying genuine tears for a stranger who had been kind to his sister. What's your name? Richard asked gently. Tommy, sir. Tommy, how old are you? 10, I'll be 11 next month. And where's your grandmother now? Does she know you're here? Tommy nodded. She's at home. She doesn't walk too good anymore, so I come by myself. I take the bus from our neighborhood. It's not far. A 10-year-old boy taking the bus alone across town to bring wildflowers to a grave, keeping a promise to his dead sister, living with an elderly grandmother who couldn't work. Richard thought about his own mansion, his fleet of cars, his investment portfolios. What had he done with all that wealth? Built a bigger empire, made more money, bought things he didn't need, and Daniel, who had access to all of it, had used it to help a dying girl and her struggling family. Quietly, without recognition, without even telling his own father. Tommy, Richard said slowly, would you like to have breakfast with me? I'd really like to hear more about your sister and about Daniel. The stories you know. Tommy looked surprised and a little scared. I don't want to bother you, sir. You're not bothering me. I'm asking. Please, it would mean a lot to me. The boy hesitated, then nodded slowly. Okay, but can we put the flowers down first? They walked together to Daniel's grave. Tommy carefully placed the wildflowers at the base of the headstone, next to the white roses Richard had brought. The contrast was stark, expensive roses next to field flowers, but somehow they looked right together. Richard stood there, looking at his son's name carved in the granite, seeing it with new eyes. He'd thought he was coming here to mourn, Instead, he'd found something unexpected, a doorway to a part of Daniel's life he'd never known existed. And this young boy, with his worn-out jacket and homemade bouquet, was the key to understanding the son he'd lost but never truly known. "Thank you, Tommy," Richard said quietly. "Thank you for keeping your promise to your sister, and thank you for showing up here today." As they walked back down the path toward the parking lot, Richard felt something he hadn't felt in 3 years. It wasn't quite hope and it wasn't quite peace. It was more like a crack in the wall he'd built around himself, letting in just a sliver of light. Maybe, just maybe, there was still a way to know his son. Maybe through this unlikely friendship with a grieving 10-year-old boy, Richard could finally understand what Daniel's life had really meant. The morning fog was starting to lift, and the sun was breaking through the clouds. Richard looked down at Tommy walking beside him, this small, brave boy who'd kept his sister's promise and made a decision. He didn't know where this was leading, but he knew one thing for certain. He wasn't going to let this moment slip away like he'd let so many moments with Daniel slip away. Sometimes, he thought, life gives you a second chance in the most unexpected ways, and this time Richard was determined not to waste it. The diner Richard chose was small and tucked away on a quiet street corner, the kind of place he would never normally go. But something told him that taking Tommy to one of his usual expensive restaurants would make the boy uncomfortable. This place had red vinyl booths, a checkerboard floor, and the smell of coffee and bacon in the air. It was warm and lived in, and Tommy seemed to relax a little when they walked through the door. A waitress with tired eyes and a kind smile showed them to a corner booth. She handed them menus and poured coffee for Richard without asking. Tommy stared at the menu like it was written in a foreign language, his eyes wide. "Order anything you want," Richard said gently. "Really, anything." Tommy bit his lip. "Are you sure? I don't want to be expensive." Richard felt something twist in his chest. When was the last time he'd worried about the cost of a meal? "I'm sure." "How about pancakes? Do you like pancakes?" Tommy's face lit up. "I love pancakes. Grandma makes them sometimes, but we don't have syrup most of the time." When the waitress came back, Richard ordered pancakes for Tommy with extra syrup, bacon, eggs, and orange juice. For himself, he just ordered toast and more coffee. He wasn't hungry. He was too focused on this boy sitting across from him, this unexpected connection to his son's hidden life. "So," Richard said once the waitress left, "tell me about Linda. What was she like?" Tommy's expression softened. "She was the best sister anyone could have. After Mom died, Linda was only 17, but she took care of everything. She worked 2 jobs while finishing high school so Grandma wouldn't have to worry. She was always tired, but she never complained. She always made time to help me with my homework and pack my lunch for school. She sounds like a remarkable person," Richard said. "She was. When she got sick, she kept apologizing to me and Grandma like it was her fault. Can you imagine? She was dying and she felt bad about it." Tommy's voice cracked. "She tried so hard to keep working, to keep taking care of us, but the treatments made her so weak. That's when things got really bad." The food arrived and Tommy stared at the stack of pancakes like he'd never seen anything so beautiful. He picked up his fork hesitantly, then looked at Richard as if asking permission. Richard nodded and the boy began to eat, slowly at first, then with the hunger of someone who didn't always know where his next meal was coming from. Richard sipped his coffee and waited. He'd learned in business that sometimes silence was the best way to get people to open up. After a few bites, Tommy continued. "Linda met your son at college. She was taking night classes, trying to get a degree so she could get a better job. She told me Daniel was in her sociology class. At first, they were just study partners. But Linda said he was different from other people. He actually listened when she talked. He asked questions about her life, about me and Grandma. Most people didn't want to hear about our problems." Tommy paused to take a drink of orange juice, and Richard noticed the boy was being careful not to spill anything, not to make a mess. Everything about him spoke of someone who was used to being invisible, to not taking up too much space. When Linda's symptoms got worse and she had to go to the hospital for tests, Daniel noticed she was missing class. He found out which hospital she was in and just showed up one day with her class notes. Linda said she was so embarrassed. She didn't want anyone from school to see her like that, all pale and sick. But Daniel didn't care. He pulled up a chair and stayed for 3 hours, helping her understand the material she'd missed. Richard tried to imagine this. His son, who he'd thought spent all his time either in class or arguing with him about his future, sitting in a hospital room with a sick girl, patiently going over sociology notes. After that, Daniel came every day, Tommy said. Even when Linda told him he didn't have to, that she'd be fine. He brought her books, magazines, funny videos on his phone. He made her laugh when she felt like crying. And when the bills started piling up, when Grandma was crying because she didn't know how we'd pay for everything, Daniel did something incredible. Tommy set down his fork and looked directly at Richard. He told Linda about this charity fund at the university, said it was for students facing medical hardships. He helped her fill out all the paperwork. A week later, the hospital called and said a large payment had been made on her account. Then more payments came. The medicine Linda needed, the treatments, everything started getting covered. And Linda figured out it was Daniel? Richard asked quietly. Tommy nodded. She wasn't stupid. She checked with the university, and they said they didn't have any fund like that. She confronted Daniel about it, and he finally admitted it was him. But he made her promise not to tell anyone. He said he had more money than he needed, and helping her made him happier than anything else he could spend it on. Richard felt tears burning behind his eyes. He took a sip of coffee to compose himself. All those times he'd lectured Daniel about responsibility, about building his own fortune, about not being soft in business. And here his son had been, using his trust fund to save someone's life. Linda felt guilty about taking the money, Tommy continued. But Daniel told her something she never forgot. He said that his father, that's you, had taught him that money was a tool. It was meant to be used. And he wanted to use it to help people who deserved help. He said Linda deserved to live, to finish her degree, to take care of her family. He said she was worth it. Richard had to look away. Yes, he'd taught Daniel that money was a tool. But he'd meant it should be used to make more money, to build wealth, to secure power. He'd never imagined his son would take that lesson and turn it into something so much better. Your son talked about you sometimes, Tommy said softly. Linda told me. He said you were the smartest man he knew, the hardest working. He said he wanted to make you proud, but he also wanted to do things differently. He wanted to use everything you'd taught him, but in his own way. Richard's throat felt tight. Did he ever say he was angry with me? Tommy thought for a moment. Linda said he seemed sad sometimes. She said he wished you could see what he saw, the people who needed help, the difference money could make in their lives. But I don't think he was angry. Linda said he loved you a lot. He just didn't know how to make you understand. The words hit Richard like a physical blow. All those fights, all those tense dinners where they barely spoke, all that time wasted, and Daniel had loved him through all of it. When did Linda's condition get worse? Richard asked, needing to know the whole story. After the accident, Tommy said quietly. When Daniel died, something broke in Linda. She kept going to treatments, but her heart wasn't in it anymore. She'd cry at night when she thought I couldn't hear. She blamed herself, said maybe if she hadn't been sick, Daniel wouldn't have been so stressed, wouldn't have been driving in the rain that night. That's not true, Richard said firmly. The accident wasn't anyone's fault. It was just a terrible thing that happened. I know that now, Tommy said. But Linda couldn't stop thinking it. She got weaker and weaker. The last month, she was back in the hospital full time. She knew she was dying. That's when she made me promise about the flowers. Tommy pushed his empty plate away and looked down at his hands. She said it was important. She said Daniel had given her hope when she had none, and the least we could do was remember him. She said he'd wanted to start a foundation to help kids like her, kids who were sick but couldn't afford treatment. She said it was his dream, and even though he couldn't do it, someone should remember that dream existed. Richard sat back in the booth, his mind racing. A foundation. Daniel had wanted to start a foundation. How had he not known this? How had he been so blind to everything his son cared about? Tommy, Richard said slowly, where do you and your grandmother live? Do you have enough food? Are you going to school? The boy looked uncomfortable. We get by. Grandma gets a small pension and I do some work after school. I deliver newspapers, help Mr. Chen at the corner store sometimes. We're okay. What kind of work does a 10-year-old do at a corner store? I stock shelves, sweep up, take out trash. Mr. Chen gives me $20 a week and lets me take home food that's about to expire. It helps, $20 a week. Richard spent more than that on a single cup of coffee at his office building. This child was working to help feed himself and his grandmother, getting up early to take a bus across town to honor a promise to his dead sister, And he still found time to go to school. "What do you want to be when you grow up?" Richard asked. Tommy's eyes brightened a little. "A doctor. I want to help people like Linda, people who are sick. I want to find ways to make treatments better, less expensive. I know it's probably impossible. Medical school costs so much money and we don't have any. But Linda always said I should dream big." Richard felt something shift inside him. This boy, who had every reason to be bitter and angry at the world, wanted to help others. Just like Daniel had. "It's not impossible," Richard said firmly. "Don't ever think that. If you work hard in school, if you keep that dream alive, you'll find a way." Tommy smiled sadly. "That's what Linda used to say. And Daniel too, she told me. He believed people could do anything if they didn't give up." They sat in silence for a moment. The diner was starting to fill up with the late morning crowd, families and couples chatting over breakfast. Normal people living normal lives. Richard had spent so much of his life separate from this world, insulated by his wealth. When had he last sat in a place like this, talking to someone like Tommy, hearing about real struggles and real dreams? "I should probably go," Tommy said reluctantly. "Grandma will worry if I'm gone too long." "Let me drive you home," Richard offered. "It's the least I can do." "Oh no, sir, I couldn't. The bus is fine. Please. I insist. And Tommy, I want to meet your grandmother. I want to thank her for raising such a good young man. Would that be okay?" Tommy looked uncertain but finally nodded. "I guess that would be okay. But our apartment isn't nice like what you're probably used to." "I don't care about nice," Richard said, and he realized he meant it. "I care about meeting the family of the girl who knew my son, who saw him for who he really was." Richard paid the bill, leaving a generous tip that made the waitress's eyes go wide. As they walked to his car, Tommy moved hesitantly, like he was afraid to touch anything. Richard opened the passenger door for him, and the boy climbed in carefully, his eyes taking in the leather seats and polished dashboard. During the drive, Tommy gave directions in a quiet voice. They left the nice part of town and headed toward an area Richard rarely visited. The buildings got older, the streets narrower. They passed liquor stores with bars on the windows, apartment buildings with laundry hanging from balconies, small shops with signs in multiple languages. Tommy pointed to a 5-story building with faded red brick. "That's it. We're on the 3rd floor." Richard parked on the street and followed Tommy inside. The lobby smelled of cooking spices and old carpet. They climbed stairs with worn treads, passing doors where Richard could hear televisions blaring and babies crying. This was a world away from his penthouse, from his gated community, from everything he knew. Tommy's apartment was at the end of a dim hallway. The boy pulled out a key on a string around his neck and opened the door. "Grandma, I'm home. I brought someone." The apartment was tiny but spotlessly clean. The furniture was old but well maintained. Photos covered every surface, most of them showing a beautiful young woman with Tommy's eyes. Linda, Richard realized. This was Linda. An elderly woman shuffled out from the kitchen, leaning on a cane. She was small and frail, with white hair pulled back in a bun. When she saw Richard in his expensive suit standing in her doorway, her eyes widened with alarm. "Tommy, who is this? What's wrong?" "It's okay, Grandma," Tommy said quickly. "This is Daniel's father. You know, the man Linda knew. We met at the cemetery." The old woman's hand went to her mouth. She looked at Richard with tears suddenly filling her eyes. "Oh," she whispered. "Oh, you're Daniel's father. Your son, he was an angel sent to us in our darkest time." And then this elderly woman, who Richard had never met before, who lived in this tiny apartment in a part of town he never visited, stepped forward and took his hand in both of hers. Her hands were rough and weathered, the hands of someone who'd worked hard their entire life. "Thank you," she said, her voice breaking. "Thank you for raising such a beautiful soul. Because of your son, my Linda had hope. Because of your son, she smiled in her last days. Thank you." Richard stood there holding this stranger's hands and felt something break open inside him. All the walls he'd built, all the control he'd maintained, all the grief he'd locked away, it all came flooding out. And for the first time since Daniel's death, Richard Morrison broke down and cried. Richard couldn't remember the last time he'd cried in front of anyone. Maybe at Daniel's funeral, though even then he'd tried to hold himself together to be strong for the relatives and business associates who'd come to pay their respects. But here, in this small apartment with its worn furniture and faded curtains, standing with an elderly woman who barely knew him, he let himself break. Tommy's grandmother, Mrs. Chen, didn't say anything. She just held his hands and let him cry, the way she'd probably comforted her own grandchildren through their grief. After a few moments, she gently guided him to the old couch and made him sit down. Tommy stood nearby, looking worried and unsure. "I'll make tea," Mrs. Chen said softly, patting Richard's shoulder before shuffling toward the small kitchen. Richard pulled out his handkerchief and wiped his eyes, embarrassed, but also strangely relieved. Tommy sat down beside him, not too close, giving him space. "I'm sorry," Richard said, his voice rough. "I don't usually fall apart like that." "It's okay," Tommy said quietly. "Grandma says crying is just love with nowhere to go. When you lose someone, the love doesn't stop, but they're not there anymore to receive it. So it comes out as tears." Richard looked at this 10-year-old boy with wonder. "That's very wise. That's Grandma. She's full of wise things." Tommy smiled a little. "Linda used to write them all down. She said Grandma's wisdom was worth more than any book." Mrs. Chen returned with 3 mismatched cups of tea on a small tray. Her hands shook slightly as she set it down on the coffee table, but she managed without spilling. She eased herself into an old armchair across from them, her cane propped against the armrest. "I want to apologize," she said, looking at Richard with kind but tired eyes. "Linda never told me your son's full name, or that his father was Richard Morrison, the businessman. She just called him Daniel. If I had known, I would have tried to contact you after the accident, to tell you what your son meant to us." "Please don't apologize," Richard said. "I'm the one who should apologize. I didn't even know Linda existed. Daniel never told me about her, and I never asked enough questions about his life. I was too busy trying to make him into something he wasn't." Mrs. Chen sipped her tea slowly. "Linda didn't tell us much at first either. She was a private girl, didn't want us to worry, but I could see the change in her. Even when she was sick, she started smiling again. She had hope. And when I finally met Daniel, I understood why." "You met him?" Richard leaned forward. "Once. He came here to pick up Linda for a doctor's appointment. She was too weak to take the bus, and I couldn't drive anymore. Daniel insisted on taking her. He came up to help her down the stairs." Mrs. Chen's eyes grew distant with memory. Such a polite young man. "He looked around this place, and do you know what he said? He said it felt like a real home, that you could feel the love in it. Not many young people from his world would say something like that." Richard thought about his own house, his massive estate with its 12 bedrooms and pristine gardens. Did it feel like a home? Or was it just an expensive place where he slept? "After that, Daniel came a few times," Mrs. Chen continued. "Sometimes he'd bring groceries and pretend Linda had asked him to pick them up. Sometimes he'd bring homework for Tommy and say his friend's little brother had recommended the books. Always with an excuse, always making it seem like he wasn't really helping, so we wouldn't feel like charity cases." "That sounds like him," Richard said softly. Even as a boy, Daniel had been thoughtful like that. Richard remembered when Daniel was 12 and had used his allowance to buy lunch for a classmate whose family was struggling. When Richard had found out, he'd lectured Daniel about being smart with money. God, he'd been such a fool. Tommy had been quiet, but now he spoke up. "Grandma, should we show him?" Mrs. Chen and Tommy exchanged a look, some silent conversation passing between them. Finally, the old woman nodded. "Yes, I think Linda would want him to see." Tommy got up and disappeared into what must have been a bedroom. Richard could hear him moving things around, opening drawers. Mrs. Chen watched Richard carefully. "Your son wrote letters to Linda," she said. "When she was too sick to see visitors, when the treatments made her too weak to talk on the phone, he wrote her letters. Real letters with pen and paper. Linda kept every single one." Richard's heart began to pound. Letters. Daniel had written letters. Tommy came back carrying a shoebox tied with a faded ribbon. He set it carefully on the coffee table in front of Richard. "Linda made me promise to keep these safe. She said they were precious. I've kept them under my bed since she died. Tommy brought them to show me what your son meant to my granddaughter," Mrs. Chen said. "But I think they mean something more. I think they show who your son really was, what he cared about, what he dreamed of doing. And I think you should have them." "Oh, I couldn't," Richard protested. "These belong to Linda. They're part of her memory." "Linda is gone," Mrs. Chen said gently but firmly. "And these letters, they talk about things that never happened. Dreams that died with your son. Maybe if you read them, those dreams don't have to stay dead. Maybe there's still a way to make them real." Tommy pushed the box closer to Richard. "Please, sir." I think this is why I met you today. I think Linda and Daniel both wanted you to see these. Richard's hands trembled as he reached for the box. He untied the ribbon carefully, as if the letters inside were made of glass. When he lifted the lid, he saw stacks of envelopes, dozens of them, all addressed to Linda in Daniel's familiar handwriting. That handwriting he'd seen on school papers and birthday cards, now writing to a girl Richard had never known existed. You don't have to read them now, Mrs. Chen said. Take them home. Read them when you're ready. But please take them. Let your son talk to you through these words. Let him tell you things he maybe couldn't say in person. Richard looked up at her, then at Tommy. These people who had so little were offering him something invaluable. A chance to know his son, a window into Daniel's heart. Thank you, he whispered. Thank you both. I don't know what to say. You don't have to say anything, Mrs. Chen replied. Just promise me one thing. Promise me you'll really read them. Don't just look at them and put them away. Let your son's words reach you. I promise, Richard said, and he meant it with everything in him. He stayed for another hour, listening to stories about Linda and Daniel, about the friendship that had bloomed in a sociology classroom and grown into something beautiful. Mrs. Chen told him about the day Linda came home from the hospital, so excited because Daniel had told her about his plans for a foundation. Tommy shared memories his sister had told him, about Daniel's terrible jokes and his habit of bringing flowers that he'd picked himself, because he said store-bought ones had no soul. When Richard finally prepared to leave, he stood at the door with the shoebox under his arm. Tommy walked him to the stairs. Mr. Morrison, the boy said hesitantly, can I ask you something? Of course, anything. Do you think you'll come back? To visit, I mean. Grandma really liked talking to you. And He trailed off, looking at his feet. Richard knelt down so he was eye level with the boy. Tommy, I would very much like to come back. If that's okay with you and your grandmother, I'd like to get to know you both better. Would that be all right? Tommy nodded, a small smile breaking through. I'd like that. And maybe, if you want, I could tell you more stories about Linda and Daniel. There's a lot I didn't get to say today. I'd love that, Richard said. He reached into his wallet and pulled out a business card. This has my personal cell phone number on it. If you or your grandmother need anything at all, you call me. Okay? Tommy took the card carefully, holding it like it was valuable. Okay, thank you, sir. Richard drove home in a daze. The shoebox sat on the passenger seat, and he kept glancing at it, almost afraid it might disappear. When he pulled into his long driveway and parked in front of his enormous house, the contrast struck him hard. He'd built all this, achieved everything he'd set out to achieve. But what did it mean? What had it all been for? He carried the box inside, past his housekeeper who tried to ask him about lunch, past his home office where his laptop sat waiting with 100 unread emails, up the stairs to his bedroom. He needed privacy for this. He needed to be alone with his son's words. Richard sat on his bed, the shoebox in front of him. For a long moment he just stared at it, almost afraid to open it again. What if the letters were filled with anger about their fights? What if Daniel had written about how much he resented his father? But he'd made a promise to Mrs. Chen. He would read them, all of them. He reached in and pulled out the first letter. The envelope was dated nearly 4 years ago, a few months before Daniel's death. With shaking hands, Richard opened it and began to read. Dear Linda, I hope the treatment today wasn't too rough. I'm sorry I couldn't be there, but I had that meeting with my father. It didn't go well, but I expected that. He wants me to interview for an internship at his company this summer. I tried to explain again that I want to work at the community center, but he doesn't understand. He thinks I'm wasting my potential. Richard's eyes blurred with tears, but he kept reading. Page after page of his son's thoughts, his struggles, his dreams. But what struck Richard most was that despite their arguments, despite their differences, Daniel wrote about him with love. There was frustration, yes, and sadness, but never hatred, never bitterness. I know Dad loves me. I know he just wants what he thinks is best. But I see things differently. I look at Linda, at what she's going through, at families like hers who can't afford basic health care. And I think about all the money Dad has spent on things we don't need. Last week he bought another car, his 5th one. That car cost more than Linda's entire year of treatments. I'm not judging him. He worked hard for his money, but it makes me think about what I want to do with my life. I want to help people, Linda. Real help, not just writing checks. I want to build something that lasts, that makes a real difference. Richard set down the letter and picked up another one, then another. Hour after hour he read. The afternoon sun moved across the sky, shadows lengthened in his room, but Richard didn't notice. He was lost in his son's words, in his son's world. Some letters talked about Linda's progress, celebrating good days and encouraging her through bad ones. Some talked about classes and professors. Many talked about the foundation Daniel wanted to create. He'd thought about it deeply, planned it carefully. He wanted to help young people facing serious illnesses, give them not just medical care but hope, community, reasons to keep fighting. I've been doing research on foundations, on how to set them up, how to make them sustainable. I know Dad thinks it's a waste of time, that I should be focused on business school and profits. But what if business could be used for good? What if all the skills he's taught me about money and management could go toward helping people instead of just making more money? I want to show him that I haven't rejected everything he's taught me. I've just found a different way to use it. Richard clutched the letter to his chest, sobbing. His son had listened to him, had learned from him, had wanted to make him proud, just in a different way than Richard had imagined. And Richard had been too blind, too stubborn to see it. The last letter in the box was dated 2 days before the accident. Daniel wrote about a difficult day Linda had experienced, about sitting with her in the hospital while she cried, feeling helpless. But then he wrote something that broke Richard's heart. Linda asked me today why I care so much, why I spend so much time with her when I could be out with friends or doing things guys my age do. I told her the truth. I told her that my mother died when I was young, and my father shut down after that. He threw himself into work and I felt invisible. I don't blame him anymore. I understand he was grieving, but I promised myself I would never make anyone feel invisible. Everyone matters, Linda. You matter. Your life has value, and if I can help you see that, if I can give you reasons to keep fighting, then my time is well spent. That's what I want my life to be about. Helping people feel seen, feel valued, feel like they matter. Richard set down the letter and looked around his empty bedroom, his empty house. When had he last felt like he mattered for anything other than his money? When had he last connected with another human being in a real way? Before this morning with Tommy and Mrs. Chen, he couldn't remember. He gathered all the letters carefully, putting them back in the box. But he kept the last one out, holding it in his hands. His son's words, his son's heart, his son's dreams written down in black ink on white paper. Daniel had wanted to help people feel seen, feel valued, feel like they mattered. He'd wanted to build something lasting, something good, and he'd died before he could do it. But Richard was still here. Richard had the resources, the connections, the ability to make things happen. And suddenly, with a clarity he hadn't felt in years, Richard knew what he had to do. He pulled out his phone and started making notes. Foundation structure, mission statement, programs for young people facing serious illnesses, support for families. Everything Daniel had dreamed about, written about, planned for. Richard would make it real. He would build his son's dream and he would do it right. It was nearly midnight when Richard finally set down his phone. His eyes were tired, his back ached from sitting so long, but he felt more alive than he had in 3 years. He had a purpose again. Not just making money or building companies. Something bigger. Something that mattered. He thought about Tommy, about his dream of becoming a doctor, of helping people like Linda. He thought about Mrs. Chen, living in that tiny apartment on a small pension. He thought about all the families out there struggling with illness, with bills, with fear. And he thought about Daniel, who had seen all of this, who had cared about all of this, and who had tried in his quiet way to make a difference. I see it now, son, Richard whispered into the darkness. I finally see what you were trying to show me, and I'm going to finish what you started. I promise you that. Outside his window, the city lights twinkled like stars. Tomorrow, Richard's life would change. Tomorrow, he would start building something that would honor his son's memory in a way that actually mattered. Not a plaque or a scholarship in Daniel's name, but something real, something living. Something that would help people the way Daniel had helped Linda. For the first time since the accident, Richard felt close to his son. Not in the cemetery standing over a grave, but here, surrounded by his words, understanding his heart. And it had taken a 10-year-old boy with wildflowers and a shoebox full of letters to show him the way. Richard didn't sleep that night. Instead, he sat at his desk with Daniel's letters spread out before him, making plans. By the time dawn broke through his windows, he had pages of notes, ideas flowing faster than he could write them down. This foundation wouldn't be just another charity that rich people funded to feel good about themselves. It would be real, meaningful, exactly what Daniel had envisioned. But first, he needed help. And he knew exactly who to ask. At 8 o'clock Monday morning, Richard walked into his company's headquarters. His assistant looked surprised to see him so early, and even more surprised by the determined expression on his face. He'd seen that look before, usually right before Richard closed a major deal or launched a new venture. "Clear my schedule for the week," Richard told her. "Cancel everything except the board meeting on Friday. I have something important to work on." For the next 3 days, Richard barely left his office. He called lawyers to discuss setting up a nonprofit foundation. He contacted hospital administrators to understand what families really needed. He reached out to medical billing experts to learn about the gaps in insurance coverage that left families drowning in debt. Every call, every meeting, he thought about Linda and her struggle, about Daniel sitting by her bedside, about all the other families out there facing the same nightmare. On Wednesday afternoon, his assistant buzzed him. "Mr. Morrison, there's a young boy here to see you. He says his name is Tommy. He doesn't have an appointment, but he seems quite insistent." Richard smiled, his first real smile in days. "Send him in immediately." Tommy walked into the office looking tiny and out of place. His eyes went wide at the floor-to-ceiling windows, the expensive furniture, the view of the city stretched out below. He clutched a backpack to his chest like a shield. "Tommy," Richard said warmly, coming around his desk. "This is a wonderful surprise. Is everything okay?" "Yes, sir. I'm sorry to bother you at work. The lady at the front desk didn't want to let me up, but I showed her your card and she made a phone call. You're never a bother. Please sit down. Would you like something to drink? Are you hungry?" Tommy shook his head, perching nervously on the edge of an expensive leather chair. "I can't stay long. I have to get back to school, but I wanted to give you something." He opened his backpack and pulled out a worn notebook. This was Linda's. "I found it when I was looking for the letters. I thought maybe you'd want to see it." Richard took the notebook carefully. The cover was decorated with stickers and doodles, the kind a college student might put on their belongings. He opened it and saw pages of handwriting, some in pen, some in pencil. Notes from classes, grocery lists, but also other things, sketches and ideas. "What is this?" Richard asked softly. "Linda used to write down everything Daniel told her about his foundation idea," Tommy explained. "She said his plans were too important to forget. So whenever he talked about what he wanted to do, she'd write it down later. I think she wanted to help him remember all his ideas." Richard flipped through the pages, his heart pounding. Here were Daniel's thoughts in even more detail than the letters. Linda had organized them, categorized them. Programs for hospital patients, support groups for families, educational assistance for young people whose illness interrupted their schooling. Ways to help with everything from medical bills to transportation to just having someone to talk to who understood. "There's more," Tommy said quietly. At the back, Richard turned to the last pages and found something unexpected. Sketches of a building. Rough drawings, but detailed enough to show what Linda had imagined. A center with rooms for different activities, spaces for patients to gather, offices for counselors and social workers. At the top of the page in Linda's handwriting it said, "Daniel's dream house where hope lives." She drew this? Richard's voice came out hoarse. Tommy nodded. Linda liked to draw. She said it helped her think. After Daniel died, she spent a lot of time working on these pictures. I think it gave her something to focus on besides being sad. She told me once that even if Daniel couldn't build this place, maybe someday someone else would. Maybe someone would see that the dream was worth making real. Richard closed the notebook and held it against his chest. "Tommy, do you know what I've been doing for the past 3 days?" The boy shook his head. "I've been working on starting a foundation. Daniel's foundation. Everything he wanted to create, I'm going to make it happen. And this notebook, these plans, they're going to help me do it right." Tommy's eyes went wide. "Really? You're really going to build it?" "Yes, I'm calling it the Daniel Morrison Foundation. And Tommy, I want you and your grandmother to be part of it. I need people who understand what families are going through, who know what really helps and what doesn't. Would you be willing to help me?" "Me?" Tommy looked shocked. "But I'm just a kid. What could I do?" "You can tell me the truth," Richard said firmly. "You can tell me when my ideas are wrong or when I'm not seeing something important. You lived through this with Linda. You know what it's really like. That's worth more than any business degree. Tommy bit his lip, thinking hard. If I help, can we make sure there's something for kids like me? The brothers and sisters who aren't sick but still hurt? Linda worried about me so much. She felt bad that I had to grow up so fast that I had to work instead of just being a kid. She wanted me to have help too. Richard felt something tighten in his chest. He'd been so focused on the patients he hadn't thought about the siblings, the family members who suffered in different ways. Absolutely. That's exactly the kind of thing I need you to help me see. They spent the next hour talking, Tommy opening up more and more as he got comfortable. He told Richard about the nights he'd lain awake worrying about Linda, about feeling scared and alone because all the adults were too stressed to notice. He talked about kids at school who didn't understand why he couldn't hang out or why he always seemed tired. He shared what would have helped, simple things like someone to talk to, a place to go after school where he didn't have to be strong, people who got it. When Tommy finally had to leave for school, Richard walked him down to the lobby personally. His employees stared as their billionaire boss escorted a scruffy kid to the elevator, talking to him like he was the most important person in the building. I'll come visit you and your grandmother this weekend, Richard promised. I want to show you both what I've planned so far. Get your thoughts. Okay, Tommy said, then hesitated. Mr. Morrison, thank you for listening to me. Most adults don't really listen to kids. Thank you for teaching me how, Richard replied. Over the next few weeks, Richard's life transformed completely. He still ran his company, but it no longer consumed him. Every spare moment went to the foundation. He met with architects, showing them Linda's sketches, asking them to design a real building based on her vision. He hired social workers and counselors, people who had experience with serious illness and family support. He set up funding mechanisms not just from his own money, but creating ways for others to contribute too. And he kept going back to Tommy and Mrs. Chen's apartment. Every visit, he learned something new. Mrs. Chen shared wisdom from her years of life, practical insights about what people really needed when times were hard. Tommy talked about his friends at school, kids dealing with sick parents or siblings, helping Richard understand that the problem was bigger than he'd imagined. Richard started bringing dinner when he visited, good food from restaurants downtown. At first, Mrs. Chen protested, saying it was too much. But Richard insisted, and eventually it became their tradition. Wednesday nights, Richard would show up with food and they'd eat.